Hello guys, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. So continuing with building our backend for our job board application, right? So in this video we are going to be working with the favorites section, right? So to add a job vacancy to favorites, right, what you need is a user ID, right, so that we can reference the user that added that vacancy to the favorites, right, to the favorite schema. And then we also need the vacancy ID, right, so that we can identify the vacancy that belongs to what, to the favorites, right? So without wasting much of that time, now let's dive into our Visual Studio Code and let's start building our backend. Need to do now is let's go to our models, right, and then let's create our favorite model, right? So let's just copy this category schema right here, and then let's paste it inside our, so let's change this from category to favorite. And then let's change this to favorite, right? And then let's change it to favorite schema. Favorite schema, right? So that's it for our schema. But now, as from our entity representational diagram, we need the user, right? We need the vacancy reference. So just treat this more of like as a foreign key if you are working with relational databases, for example, such as MySQL or PostgreSQL, right? So the type is going to be a type of mongoose dot schema dot types, and then we need to make sure that we have the object ID, right? And then required, let's just set it to true, right? And then the reference is going to be the vacancy schema, right? So this reference object is just telling us that we are just referencing this schema to the vacancy schema right here, right? That's our reference right there. And then we need to do the same thing for the user, right? So let's change this to user ID, right, like this. User ID, right? And then here we can also in this to vacancy ID. So the reference in this case is going to be the user, right? So if we go into our user model, you can see that this is our user schema here, which we are referencing in our favorite model, right? So now here we've just created our favorite schema, right, which is going to have a reference. Think of it as a foreign key for the vacancy ID, right? Since in our favorites table we are going to have like a vacancy ID, a vacancy, right, and then a user ID. The user ID is used to identify the user that put this vacancy into our favorite table, right? And then to identify that vacancy we need the vacancy ID, right? So now we are done with the favorite schema, right? So now let's move on to the favorite controller, right? So now let's move into our controllers folder, right? So what I'm just going to do is let me just create a favorite controller. Okay, right. So favorite, we are just going to require the favorite model because we need to get this favorite model. We'll be working with this favorite model, right? So now we just need to export a couple of methods that I'm going to do, right? So the first one that we need to do is we need to create add favorite. Add job vacancy to favorite, right, method. And then what we need is first we need the vacancy ID. We need the vacancy ID. We also need a user ID, right? Also need a user ID. And then first of all, we need to check if we have the vacancy ID at first and the user ID, right? We need to check to make sure that they're not null, right? So if somehow they are null, then we just alert the user that please provide both vacancy ID and user ID, right? And then now what we need is a try catch block. So we need to make sure that we use a try catch block to catch errors that may pop up, right? And then if there's an error, we just display a status code 500 internal server error, right? Right, so now inside our try catch block, let's initialize our favorite. And then let's pass in the request.body, right? And then the first thing that we need to do is we need to check if a job vacancy already exists in our favorites tab, in our favorite schema, right? So just make sure that if a vacancy ID already exists, then we know that this job vacancy already exists in our favorite schema, right? And then after we have checked, what we'll simply do is we'll just favorite, and then we'll just save it to the favorite schema, right? And then we'll just display a response.status for 201, right? And then the message we are just going to display is added to favorites. Added to favorites, right? And then if there is an error, then we are just going to display an internal server error, right? So now we need a method for getting all the favorites, right? Get Because now what we are doing is we need to get the favorites, but to get the favorites, we need to get the favorites using the user's ID, right? Because you find that each user will have their own favorites, right? So we just need to make sure that we find by ID, right? And then after this, we need to populate, right? We need to populate. To populate this, we need to populate it with the vacancies, right? So we'll provide the path. The path is going to be vacancy. The path is going to be vacancy ID, and then we are just going to select. We need the title, description, requirements, skill text, skill text, experience, salary, and then benefits. Right, and then after this, we just need to display, we just need response dot status. And then we just return the favorites, right? If there's an error, let's just return a response in internal server error, right? And then another method for deleting the favorites, right? Just in case a user wants to remove favorites, right? So we need an ID, which is coming from the request.parameters.id, right? Try cache block. So what we need is we need to find by ID and delete, and then pass in the ID, right? And then once the item is deleted, we can just return as response.status code, right? 200 to show that it was successful, and then a JSON message. The JSON message, which is going to be removed from favorites, right? Like this, right? So these are the methods that we need, right? So let me just go through them. We have this method for adding our vacancy to favorites, right? So to add our vacancy to favorites, we need the vacancy ID, and then we need the user ID, right? Which they'll come from the request.body, right? And then we are first going to check if we have the vacancy ID and the user ID. If we don't have, we are just going to return the status code 400 with the message that please provide both vacancy ID and user ID, right? And then inside our try cache block, what we need to do is we need to initialize our favorites, right? And then inside the favorites, we are just going to pass in the request.body, right? And then we need to check if a job vacancy already exists in our favorite schema, right? So to do so, we just use the favorite.find1, and then we find by vacancy ID, right? We find it by vacancy ID, right? And then we check if the favorite item exists, right? If it exists, we'll just return a status code 400 with the message that job already added to favorites, right? And then if it doesn't exist, then we just save it inside our favorite schema, right? And then we'll then return a status code 201 with the message added to favorites, right? And then if somehow there's an error with our server, we just return status code 500 with the message internal server error, right? And then we have this method for getting our job vacancies from the favorite schema, right? So what we do here, first we need an ID, which is going to come from the request parameters.id, right? And then we create a variable to just store like the favorite, right? Which we are going to get by user ID, right? Because each user is going to have like their own favorites, right? So want it to be distinct to each user, right? So we are going to get it by the user ID, which will pass in the ID, right? And then once we do that, we are just going to populate with the vacancy, right? So to populate the vacancy, the path is going to be the vacancy ID, because if we go into our vacancy model, right? Let's go back into our favorite model. We have this vacancy ID. This vacancy ID is referring to our Mongoose schema, right? It's referring to our Mongoose schema, and also referring to our vacancy model, right? That's why you find that we are going inside our favorite controller, right? We are going to populate with the vacancy ID, right? And then the fields that we are going to populate with are going to be the title, the description, requirements, skill text, experience, salary, and then the benefits, right? Once we do that, we are going to return a status code 200 with the favorites, right? And then if there is an error, we are just going to return a status code 500 with a message internal server error, right? And then we have this method for deleting favorites, right? So this method that we have here for deleting favorites, first we need an ID. It's going to come from the request parameters.id, right? And then what we are just going to do here is we are just going to create this favorite variable, and then we are just going to find by ID and delete, which we are going to pass in the ID right here. And then if the deletion process is complete, we are just going to return a status code 200 with the message removed from favorites, right? And then otherwise, if there's an error, we are just going to return status code 500 with the message internal server error, right? So we are done with the favorite controller. Now what we need to work on is our favorite route, right? So our favorite route.js, right? So I'm just going to copy this, and then I'm just going to paste it inside here. So instead of category controller here, I'm just going to change to favorite controller, and then let's get it from the favorite controller, right? And then controller, and then favorite controller right there, right? So what I'm just going to do here to post, we are just going to have favorite controller dot add job vacancies to favorite, right? And then here favorite controller dot get favorites, right? But we need to pass in an ID right there. We need to pass in an ID. And then here favorite controller dot delete the favorites, right? Favorite controller dot delete favorites, right? So now we are done with our favorite route, right? Now we need to move on into our server.js, right? So what I'm just going to do here, I'm just going to copy this, and then I'm just going to paste it below, and then I'm just going to change this one to favorite route, right? Favorite route, and then we need to initialize, right, routes, and then favorite route, right? And then here we're just going to use app.use, and then API favorites, right? And then favorite route right here, right there, and then passing favorite route, right? So now our backend is complete. So now let's just try to run it, and let's see if it's actually working. Yes, we are working on now it's connected to database. Our application is running on port 6013. So what I'm just going to do here, I'm just going to pull up Postman, and then we'll just try to test our backend, right? So what we need here is I'm just going to copy this, and then I'm just going to paste it here, and then favorites, right? And then what I'm just going to do is, let's go into our login user route, right? Login user route, and then let's try to log in. Okay, let's try to log in. Okay, you can see now we have our user ID right there. So if you still remember, for us to get like a list of favorites, we need to pass in the user ID, right? As you can see, we don't have favorites currently right now, right? So we don't have right now. So what I'm just going to do is, I'm just going to remove this, and then I'm just going to go to our body. And then what I'm just going to do here is I'm going to use vacancy ID. I'm just going to pass in the vacancy ID variable, right? And then if we go to our vacancies right there, let's just find a vacancy ID that we can use. So let's try to get vacancies. Okay, we have this vacancy, and then this is the vacancy ID right here. Let's copy it because we need the vacancy ID. So let's just copy the vacancy ID right there. Let's paste it here. We also need a user ID. So let's try to get a user ID from this item, right? So user ID, login user, and then let's get the user ID right there. We get the user ID right there, and then let's paste it inside. So now we are doing a post request, right? Added to favorites. You can see now we have added this vacancy to favorite. Let's try again. Job already added to favorites. You can see that we already have this job vacancy to favorites, so that's why it refused, right? But let's go and then let's grab another vacancy ID. Let's grab this vacancy ID right there, right? And then let's go back, and then let's try to do a post request again, right? Edit to favorites. You can see now we have added to favorites, get the vacancy, right? So let's try to get the vacancy, and then to get vacancy, as you can remember, we need to pass in the vacancy ID right here, right? So let's try to get the vacancies. You can see now these are the vacancies that we added to favorites. You can see them right there, right? And then so let's try to delete a vacancy. So let's try to delete a vacancy. You copy the vacancy ID, you just put it after the favorites, and then let's try to delete the vacancy right there. Removed from favorites. You can see that you have removed it from favorite. Okay, so that was it, guys, on adding job vacancies to favorites. So in the next video we are going to be working on the resume, and then we'll work on the application, right?